By your powers combined, I am Captain Planet!
Captain Planet, he's our hero. Gonna take pollution down to zero. He's our powers magnified, and he's fighting on the planet side. Captain Planet, he's our hero. Gonna take pollution down to zero.
Did you watch that as a kid?
Oh yeah, man. Ages 3 to 6 every Saturday morning at 6:30 a.m. on Channel 13.
Captain Planet.
Captain Planet. It was the greatest thing ever. I mean, the villains were always these corporate tycoons. They're usually fat and slobby, and they were always had the same crime. They were dumping sludge into the river, and fish were dying. It was awful.
Oh my goodness.
And Captain Planet was the guy. He would save the day. And yeah, I mean, it was the 90s. What can I say? All of us 5-year-olds were mini environmentalists.
This is obviously what we should be doing today. Let's save the earth.
Well, you know, that does seem to be what Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez seems to think. And that's what we're on today on What's the Res. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a special bonus episode of What's the Res, an ongoing conversation about the current resolutions in the world of high school debate. My name's Josh Herring. Today I'm here with Ethan Delves, and today is kind of a special day because something dumb came across my desk, and I decided that we had a duty to the world, to the internet, to our friends, to each other, to mock this dumb thing.
Let's address this.
Yeah, but we're not alone. Lots of different web pages today have been mocking the latest non-binding resolution to come across the floor of Congress. And it is, of course, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. And Ethan, what's your, before we get into this, let's at least lay out our biases and try to be fair. So do you have political leanings? Do you care about politics? What are your thoughts?
So I do care about politics, and I think that being where I am and having taken counsel from many different people, I feel like I lean probably more towards a conservative side of the spectrum. But, you know, I'm not an adult yet. Who knows where that's going to go. I'm not a voter. I have pretty much no say, but I do have say on this podcast. And I think that my main concern with what came across your desk today is how the premise doesn't really attach to the methodology of the conclusion. Like, we're talking about, just a little spoiler alert, helping with global warming, and then the ways that our Senate plans to go about doing this don't really seem to match up with global warming. I see no correlation and no causation whatsoever.
Well, I'm glad you want to mention that, because part of our goal here, just so that we're clear and upfront from the beginning, we're honestly not trying to bash a Democratic Party platform position, which does seem to be what this is. But that's not our goal. Is here not to bash the Democratic Party, but rather to apply the tools of logic to look at a piece of proposed policy. Which, of course, this is not actually policy yet. It's, as we'll get into, it's asking for a policy to be made and hinting at what that policy should have. But in doing that, it's laying out a certain vision. And as Ethan already mentioned, the main problem is that the premises simply don't lead to the conclusion. Right. So if this were to be put in place, we both think this would lead to bad policy. Now, and since I asked Ethan to disclose his political leanings, I'll also mention that I am thoroughly on the conservative side. I'm on the traditionalist camp of conservatism, so I look to Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver as some of my political heroes, and their vision of preserving a tradition of what is good, true, and beautiful from generation to generation and passing that on. Now, that kind of conservatism means I don't necessarily line up with any particular political party. I tend to be more frustrated with both political parties than excited about either one.
Right. I can see frustration definitely on both sides. I'm not going to say that I am firmly on one or the other, but being a debater and being able to see both sides of any debate, both parties, especially in the media, can be extremely frustrating, and it's really hard to get ideas straight, like what's true, what's not true, and what is just a flat-out lie.
Well, let's get into it, because and the copy that we're both working from, I got this off of NPR's website. They link to a PDF file of what was brought in the House of Representatives. So the title of this document reads, the House of Representatives recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal. In the House of Representatives, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez submitted the following resolutions. And then it begins, resolution, recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal. This document is 14 pages, printed on 8.5 by 11, and as a general methodology, we're going to kind of follow the spirit of the TV show Mystery Science Theater 3000, where we're going to take a look at one part or various parts of this resolution, and we're going to rather try to point out what is dumb about this document.
Right. Let's do it.
All right. So let's begin on page 2, because after laying out several claims involving lots of numbers, they're all dealing with climatology and things that we may or may not have any expertise on. We get to the the goal of this resolution, which is looking for net zero emissions by 2050.
Wow. Just wow.
Indeed. 2050. So we've got a time frame there. That's helpful.
Right.
31 years, we're going to have net zero emissions. Okay. Ethan, could you read us the next bit that starts whereas at the bottom of page 2?
Whereas because the United States has historically been responsible for a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions, having emitted 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions through 2014, and has a high technological capability, the United States must take a leading role in reducing emissions through economic transformation.
Okay. Well, now the first thing I see in here is that we have a clear syllogistic structure.
Right.
But the problem is that this syllogism swaps the terms and commits the fallacy of equivocation. We've got the premises that are establishing why the United States should do this. Because the United States emits 20% of global greenhouse gases, and because the United States has a high technological capacity, therefore the United States must take a leading role in reducing emissions through economic transformation.
Right. I see a problem there.
What problem? What are you seeing?
Well, where's the attachment between how exactly could economic transformation lead to what the premises specifically entail? Like, again, I think a common theme we'll see throughout this entire document is correlation and causation, linking premises and conclusions, and I feel like this is the first indication of where that kind of falls through. And just to point to something on page 1 that was before, it says the first point that says number 1. Human activity is the dominant cause of observed climate change over the past century. Just laying it right out there. Not like this is a debate case where you would need proof, but I remember we had an entire debate, an entire day dedicated to debating this specific topic, and to just lay it out there like that's definitely a shock to me. That's a bold claim to put on the second sentence of your document. For sure.
I'm glad you took us back there, because I remember that day. I remember we had a scientist from Duke University came and spoke, and he laid out some of the evidence showing that there is scientific consensus that climate change is real, but there's not consensus over how much of a role human beings have played in that. So you're absolutely right. We've got the assertion of something that there is no proof for.
Yeah.
Now, but from the get-go, I think one of the biggest issues I have with this whole document is that it is picking up on a fear that people have. It's a widespread narrative I've seen amongst my students, I've seen amongst fellow faculty, and the fear is that climate change is happening and it's causing the world as we know it to become different. And that fear is what they're playing on, but this whole document is then trying to use that fear-mongering, to propel us into accepting an economic narrative that is quite different from what everybody would accept. Where we might have an agreement on the reality of climate change, we don't have an agreement as a nation that the federal government intervening drastically in the economy and infrastructure of even everyday buildings is itself the solution.
And I think that as we progress throughout this document, we're going to see that this economic narrative that you're referring to doesn't necessarily lead to global warming. There seem to be a lot of other very convenient topics that are placed in this document that don't really seem to have anything to do with global warming. I think we'll touch on a couple of those as well.
Convenience, a great word. I was reading a Politico article today that we'll put in the show notes for this episode. It was talking about how this document seems to be a collection of a lot of far-left progressive policy positions that have been advocated in recent years that are all kind of thrust under this idea of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, and I've seen that not only do people on the right side of the spectrum disagree with this policy utterly and completely, but this policy isn't gaining that much support on the left either. I've seen a little bit of support within Congress, but ultimately I think this plan has been seen as an extremely dumb idea, and there's definitely no causation to argue for anything that's been put inside of this document.
Well, let's move on then, before we to make sure we don't commit the same fallacy that we're accusing this document of
Right.
giving broad claims without support.
Let's support.
So let's look at on page 3. We get a description of several related crises the United States is experiencing, and in point 1 on page 3, we get a list of basic needs. Which struck me as interesting. These are all listed as basic needs that are equivalent to each other. Clean air, clean water, healthy food, adequate health care, housing, transportation, and education.
Okay. I mean, I love education. I love my education, but I definitely don't eat it or drink it every day to stay alive.
Air? I mean,
Air.
on the same level as air.
Yeah.
But education is as vital and as necessary as air.
I cannot breathe without education, Josh.
And now, even notice, we've even got an adjective attached to healthcare. Now, I'm a fan of healthcare. I like my healthcare plan. It's not the greatest, but it helps out. But notice that here, we're not even saying, like, you have a universal access to healthcare. We have a universal basic need, right, or basic need of adequate healthcare. And who decides what adequate is?
Exactly. Very ambiguous term.
It's
for
a
sure.
very
I
vague,
can see this
ambiguous
falling
term.
apart.
Now, in point 2, we move on for more broad claims. Apparently, we are in a 4-decade trend of economic stagnation, deindustrialization, and anti-labor policies.
I think that if you listen to our previous episode talking about the federal debt for our Coolidge resolution analysis, that 4-decade trend of economic stagnation doesn't seem very viable, because we had just talked about how the economy has actually been rising over the past few decades and on a general uphill.
You're absolutely right. And I remember certainly the 1990s into the early 2000s. Though, you had the rise, the slight fall, but the continued rise of the internet economy. And we have a massive new arm of economic activity happening in the United States and the world that's enabled through new technology that this resolution seems ignorant of. Now, underneath point 2, we get a list of things that these economic stagnation, deindustrialization, and anti-labor policies have supposedly led to. When I read through these, I was just struck by all of these are claims that require proof.
Right. All of them.
Ethan, why don't you take off reading, if you'll just jog us through points A through D there, and
Right.
let's just hear what needs some proof, but is instead just asserted.
Okay. Point A, hourly wages overall stagnating since the 1970s despite increased worker productivity. Point B, the third worst level of socioeconomic mobility in the developed world before the Great Recession. Point C, the erosion of the earning and bargaining power of workers in the United States. And point D, inadequate resources for the public sector workers to confront the challenges of climate change at local, state, and federal levels. I think that definitely the first thing that sticks out to me, remember the headline where it's talking about the United States is currently experiencing several related crises. Now, my main question, how do these relate to global warming? I can, hourly wages, erosion of earning and bargaining. I'm ready, sitting here and expecting for the causation link between hourly wages and how hot the world is getting.
Now, and this may be nitpicking, but I'm perfectly happy to nitpick on this kind of a document. This document uses the language of hourly wages. It doesn't use the economic term real wages, which would look at, or absolute wages, which would look at the purchasing power of those wages. From the 1970s till today, the minimum wage has gone up. So at the very basic, universally recognizable standard of a minimum wage, that number has risen substantially from somewhere around $2 and a few cents to a national minimum wage of $7.15, and many states have raised that now to $15 an hour.
Right.
Which says at a very minimum, the hourly wage has not stagnated from the 1970s. Now, it's perfectly plausible. I'm sure there's a way to explain that statement so that it makes sense, but here we're not given any proof. Instead, this is just asserted, and we should believe this on the face of it.
Right.
Now, the bottom half of point 2 goes on to discuss the large racial wealth divide in point B, and then in point C, a gender earnings gap that results in women earning approximately 80% as much as men at the median. Now, again, I want proof. I want some level of evidence that supports that, and instead, this is just asserted as if, well, everyone knows. But the trouble with what everyone knows is that in this case, we don't all know that. I want proof of that. What industries is this resolution talking about?
This is certainly new information to me, that racial wealth divide and gender earnings gaps have to do with the global warming, and how addressing global warming is going to help us battle these problems.
Well, hold on to your hat, Ethan, because we're about to get to the biggest claim, one of the biggest claims in this whole thing.
Yes, here we go.
The bottom of page 3 on to the top of page 4, we get this statement. Whereas climate change, pollution, and environmental destruction have exacerbated systemic racial, regional, social, environmental, and economic injustices, referred to in this preamble as systemic injustices, by disproportionately affecting indigenous communities, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, women with disabilities, and youth. And we're going to go on from there. There's two things that leapt out at me in this bit. The first is that we have a bunch of external factors that are beyond any individual human control. No individual human can affect climate change positively or negatively. Pollution as a reality of a post-industrial world is not something one individual can do. Environmental destruction is something that is, if it's true, if it's real, is on a systemic level. These are but then go on to connect these two systemic, racial, regional, social, environmental, and economic injustices that are all a factor of particular places and interaction between actual human beings.
Right.
So these two things are very different categories. One of these, this first group of issues, is huge, systemic in scope, but the others are dealing with actual human interactions. We can't connect these two the way that this resolution is trying to connect them. Now, Ethan, what do you make of this group of communities that are listed here? Do you see any that, it's in that first paragraph on page 4, are there any that strike you as odd to be kind of grouped together like this?
Well, I think I would completely agree with your point as to how we're kind of talking about two completely different worlds here, like the whole systemic world, and then all of these groups kind of grouped together. It puts low-income workers, women especially together, and as well as the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth to follow. So I feel like this is, again, conveniently listing all of these groups of people, but it has me sitting here waiting, like, okay, now you've listed out the problems, and now we have all of the affected groups and how these groups are related to global warming. Now I'm ready. Where does this link to global warming? And then just to get to the next sentence, whereas climate change constitutes a direct threat to national security. So not only do we have problems on one side of this, now, oh wait, there's more.
There is. And we're still missing anything that strikes of proof or the link that you're asking for, which in terms of the logic means that we're looking at a situation where literally the conclusion does not follow from the premise, which is the Latin phrase non sequitur. It does not follow. Even if the premises are true, these premises do not lead us to the conclusion that therefore we need the kind of thing that this Green New Deal is asking for.
One more thing I'm looking for is where's the differentiation for the groups that weren't listed in this paragraph? How do they not have to do with something environmental? Are they not citizens or regular citizens in one party and regular institutions in other parties that could very well contribute to pollution just as well as any of these other people could and be affected by pollution in the exact same ways? How are those parties not listed in here? And where's the definitive link between them not being related to the issue at hand?
That's a great question. I'd love to see that question answered here. Now, if we go down further on the page, we get a demonstrably false claim. This is the next whereas. Whereas the federal government-led mobilizations during World War II and the New Deal created the greatest middle class that the United States has ever seen. Now, for starters, the creation of the greatest middle class that the United States has ever seen is not a result of federal government-led mobilization. The New Deal did not create the baby boomer generation or the greatest generation. Instead, the New Deal exacerbated the existing economic problems of the Great Depression. And it created the beginnings of the massive debt bubble that the United States federal government has been riding since 1945. And again, to reference back to episode 2 on What's the Res for more about that. But this goes on to say that many members of frontline and vulnerable communities, all the ones that we listed just a moment ago, were excluded from many of the economic and societal benefits of those mobilizations. But the problem here one of the pieces that are listed up above here is communities of color. An awful lot of members of communities of color were directly benefited by the GI Bill coming out of their service in World War II. That was a mechanism of social mobilization. This claim is literally demonstrably, provably false.
And I hear a little undertone of this case being made right here, whereas federal government-led mobilization. So I hear it, I can smell it, where the government is coming in to take more and more control. And that kind of puts me on edge because now I'm waiting. Is there a good reason for this? Because the New Deal, remember, listeners, was put in place as a state of emergency, and it did increase our national debt by a decent amount as well. While the New Deal was effective in the short term in getting people back on their feet, remember, this plan had to go away eventually. So I see this as a justification for the federal government stepping in one instance of an emergency where it was actually effective in some matters. So I see kind of a cherry picking of examples going on here where Congress is trying to be very careful, this senator in particular is trying to be very careful to find one example of where it does work. I'd like to see some more that would help solidify this proof.
I think you're absolutely right. And just as one note of clarification, Ocasio-Cortez is a congresswoman rather than a senator.
Okay.
So
right.
just so we make sure we don't get indicted on our facts while we're indicting someone else for bad facts.
Right.
But but I think this the author, or whoever wrote this document, is in agreement with you because they're about to leap from that moment of World War II and the New Deal to what they're actually arguing for. So here we get our first clear policy proposal of what exactly is this resolution seeking. And it's at the bottom of page 4. Whereas the House of Representatives recognizes that a new national social, industrial, and economic mobilization is a historic opportunity, this is what they're going for: to create millions of good high-wage jobs in the United States, to provide unprecedented levels of prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States, and 3, to counteract systemic injustices.
Wow, that is a hefty goal.
Woo! Yes, it is. I mean, my first question is, how on earth are you going to create millions of good high-wage jobs in the United States?
Right. Is there even the money for that? Where everybody having a good high-wage job, does not the free market handle implementing these jobs? And how can we have all jobs be high-wage and equal in that way?
And what exactly is a good high-wage job? Is that $50,000, $100,000, $400,000? I don't know.
Everybody makes $400,000.
Oh, man, what a world that would be. I don't know that our money would be worth anything at that point.
I would expect not.
And of course, you cannot guarantee unprecedented levels of prosperity and economic security. That is literally impossible. A brief survey of the 20th century sees so many examples of socialist and communist states that attempted to provide exactly that guarantee. And in trying to work out their promise to fruition, they literally starve their citizens to death.
Right.
It does not work. Now notice in point 3, she claims that this is going to counteract systemic injustice. This bill is going to solve racism, problems of inequality, and this is going to solve any kind of gender disparity issues. This resolution is going to solve it all.
As well as reducing all carbon emissions by 2050 and defeating global warming and keeping it stagnant.
My goodness. What are we going to do? Well, let's move on to on page 5. We get back to that goal on page 5. The goal of this asking the federal government to create a Green New Deal is to achieve a net zero greenhouse gas emissions. It is to create millions of jobs, and it is to equip the United States to meet sustainably the challenges of the 21st century. All kinds of issues, but we really should probably move on a little bit further. Ethan, is there anything you think we should note on pages 5 or 6?
On page 5, the number one thing to take note of is the diversity of all of these different types of solutions that we plan to address by attacking the one universal problem, global warming, and how attacking that one problem can really stem to all these different solutions and benefits.
Which really means this is just picking up on the fear and the agreement people have that global warming is a problem and using it to equivocate to a whole bunch of other political issues.
Right. Seems kind of convenient that they're all there in the same paper.
Well, now, if we look on page 6, suddenly what earlier in this document was a 30-year goal by 2050, that net zero emissions goal, gets a little bit redefined, where the following goals in paragraphs A through E are going to be accomplished through a 10-year national mobilization.
Interesting.
We have shrunk the timeline, which already seemed like an aggressively fast timeline, but now by the year 2029, these things will be accomplished?
We don't need 31 years to fix global warming. We need 10.
Oh, well, not only have we sped up the pace, we've also gotten much more vague in how exactly these things are going to be
Right,
accomplished.
I noticed that as well.
Ethan, what phrases on page 6 leapt out at you as vague?
Okay, so first we have upgrading the infrastructure in the United States. This has no area for which where we want to upgrade infrastructure. Is this in cities? Is this in other areas to help bring them up to the level of cities? I remember seeing something in there about universal access to clean water. While that is slightly more of a clearly defined goal, again, any mechanisms by which to get there. This is not necessarily like a bill to just put in place. It does call for certain policies to be made. And I also saw supporting family farms. In what way do we support family? I think that was page 7. How do we go about doing this? Do we give them money? Do we give them equipment? Do we make different policies to help them do this and that? It's such a vague argument that I feel like anybody could make, and it could even go as an argument for the complete opposite side of the spectrum. Like, it's almost hard to tell that this statement is what it is anymore.
Well, and the big question in my mind as I read through this, I noted the infrastructure piece. Just above that, we get the statement that the New Deal mobilization will build resiliency against climate change disasters by leveraging funding and providing investments for community-defined projects and strategies. The funding mechanisms that are hinted at in this document are so vague and open-ended that if this were to be adopted and actual legislation crafted on this goal, it would literally be a blank check for any communities that wanted to do anything.
Right. Not to mention, on point C on page 7, meeting 100% of the power demand in the United States. How do you define power demand? If somebody simply wants more power, what if you have no home and you simply want power in this way or that way? How in the world can you meet 100% of power demand for every single citizen of the United States?
Well, and let's not stop there because it's qualified. We're not just not going to meet an unclear demand. We're going to do it through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources.
In 10 years.
In 10 years, that's going to happen.
Oh, dear.
Which means for us living here in North Carolina, that Duke Energy is gone and replaced by what exactly?
Who knows? Maybe some government, solar power plant that is simply everywhere and can meet every single need of the people.
So you're telling me that the same people who can't manage to fund their government and barely manage to keep the IRS open during tax season might be the ones who are in charge of keeping my electricity coming to my house?
Given more power, but of course.
Oh my goodness, that is a terrifying idea. Well, but we do get 2 other things that are mentioned here on this page. They're also going to dramatically expand and upgrade existing renewable power sources, and they're also going to deploy new capacity. And the only insight I can get into how this is possible is that it's just simply by declaring it by governmental fiat. If Congress says it's going to happen, boom, it happens.
And don't forget that we are also going to spur massive economic growth in clean manufacturing under point F. Again, so vague. And how does this bill even begin to go and accomplish these ends?
I don't know. And
I don't know either.
That is the biggest problem. We can't really analyze this for its lasting value without knowing exactly how any of these things
This is simply a list of nice things.
It really is. And of course, on page 8, we're going to eliminate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector as much as is technologically feasible. What exactly that means is very unclear, and I suspect I have some family members who they farm. They're very concerned about the intricate details of the farm bill.
Right.
And that farm bill is really important for their livelihood, and it's worked out in immense detail. This is not immense detail, and it could literally destroy their livelihood.
And don't forget, under the double I point at the very bottom, line 24, clean, affordable, and accessible transportation to all, as well as zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and manufacturing. So not only are we going to make investments for zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and manufacturing on behalf of the government, putting all of the money that they plan to raise towards that and other measures, but there's going to be clean, ambiguous, affordable, ambiguous, and accessible, ambiguous public transportation for the citizens.
Oh, and even if we give this bill the benefit of the doubt, even if it were possible to have zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and manufacturing, that does not currently exist.
Nor does that complement the goal of having public transportation. Like, do we want to drive cars or do we want public transportation? Where's the main goal? They have two completely clashing ideas in the exact same paragraph.
And this is literally talking about retooling the entirety of the automotive industry with technology that, if it does exist, has not yet been developed into mainstream application.
In 10 years.
In 10 years. In 10 years. You'd think this was done, but if we, as we keep on going, I'm just going to skip to page 9, letter N.
Right.
We're still on this list of very ambiguous goals, one of which is to promote the international exchange of technology, expertise, products, funding, and services with the aim of making the United States the international leader in climate action and to help other countries achieve a Green New Deal. Ethan, I was shocked when I got to this because one of the things that, in some cases, I can at least understand the progressive argument that in many cases, Western countries have been imperialist in the sense that they have told other countries how to live and act and have conquered them and made them be a certain way. I can see why there are times when that is a terrible thing to do. Those are some really dark moments in Western history. This is nothing less than embracing a new version of United States imperialism.
No, I mean, not to mention that right now, all of the investments that the government plans to make with this Green New Deal are the expensive option. Why would other countries be incentivized to take this expensive route towards massive climate change that we can't guarantee will even be effective and actually happen?
Which, of course, I mean, all of which is going to include massive government spending and only increase all of these nations' federal debt.
And where would that money come from?
Either borrowing or taxpayers, which is where this actually strikes me as an adult taxpayer as a terrifying proposition.
And I think it would actually come from both, because with the amount of policies that this policy itself aims to fix, it seems pretty universal. I would think that we would need a hefty amount of tax dollars and hefty borrowing in order to even make this possible.
Well, and even if that does happen, further on page 10, we get a textbook definition of socialism.
Right.
Where Ocasio-Cortez's resolution calls for a Green New Deal that will require the following goals and projects. Point A, providing and leveraging in a way that ensures that the public receives appropriate ownership stakes and return on investment, adequate capital, which they're going to create through currently non-existent public banks.
Right.
What this is literally saying is that the federal government will oversee the redesign of thousands of industries in order to accomplish their goal, and that the public will own these new tools of production. This is socialism by definition.
Right, I completely agree.
Which is not terribly surprising, since Ocasio-Cortez ran for office as a democratic socialist.
Right, right.
So, okay. Well, let's move on to over on page 11, we start to get a different kind of goal. Because here, one of the things that is included is looking back at those frontline and vulnerable communities that were all lumped together on a previous section. Where here we're talking about those all those communities: women, the youth, the elderly, the disabled, communities of color, and so on that were all listed earlier. Now, this Green New Deal will ensure that these frontline and vulnerable communities shall not be adversely affected, and it will provide resources, training, and high-quality education, including higher education to all peoples of the United States, with a focus on frontline and vulnerable communities, so that these communities may be full and equal participants in the Green New Deal mobilization.
And how can it even guarantee the safety of these communities in the first place? Because if all of this money is going to be taken, it's going to be taken from somewhere. Remember, the government not only borrows money from foreign countries, but within itself. If these programs have less money to operate because the money is going elsewhere, I think a lot of these communities, such as the elderly, for example, on welfare programs, could be heavily affected by all of these redesign policies that have nothing to do with the welfare system in and of itself.
That's absolutely possible with this. But I think we have to consider this back in line with where we started, looking at this whole proposal as a sort of equivocation, where we're proposing one idea, getting agreement, and then switching in a different idea.
Right.
We've already talked about equivocation. We're using the fear of climate change to get some of these proposals in place. But now on page 11, we look at really, I think, a couple other things that are snuck in. This would entail free college, and it would also entail moving members of these frontline and vulnerable communities into leadership of the Green New Deal, effectively redistributing both leadership and wealth roles in the United States economy.
Convenient.
Very, very convenient. Well, we are quickly running out of time. I think page 12, I've just made a note that I don't understand what several of these things mean because it is so ridiculously vague. We have to look at letter H, though, which guarantees a job with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacation, and retirement security to all people of the United States.
Wow. Sounds great.
It does. If only money were infinite and free and did not reflect reality in any way.
And didn't lose its value if it should be universal and free in these ways.
Ethan, would it shock you if I told you that the Congresswoman who presented this bill has an economics degree from an institution of higher learning?
I think, unfortunately, it would shock me.
I suspect that her economics professor rather regrets that reality at this point because this document is just so riddled with economic fallacies.
Oh, man.
On pages 13 and 14, we get the last guarantees of this document that really, now, and again, just so that we don't misrepresent the document, this is not itself a proposal of legislation. It's a giant arrow indicating what those who are endorsing this proposal want future legislation to look like. So if a Green New Deal, according to this proposal, were to come about, it must, according to page 13.0, be providing all people of the United States with three things. One, high-quality health care. Four things. Two, affordable, safe, and adequate housing. Three, economic security. And four, access to clean water, clean air, healthy and affordable food, and nature.
Wow.
This is the proposal for a Green New Deal, and it is riddled with economic and logical fallacies and fails to represent a policy that is based on reality and seeks to make our nation actually be a greater nation in the real world.
I mean, I was sitting here this entire time and I'm listening to all of these great things being listed out. If only, pointing out how not only do we have 31 years, oh wait, no, we only need 10. Going from adequate healthcare to high quality healthcare just in one of the final paragraphs. And I'm sitting here, wait, what about global warming? Because I was scared of that and now I'm at the end and, oh, well, surely these things must solve global warming in some way. Let's just go with it.
Well, Ethan, I appreciate you keeping us grounded there. One of my favorite quotes about politics comes from Russell Kirk, where he talks about politics is the art of the possible. And I hope that if in some bizarre alternative world, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez listens to our podcast, that she would take this policy and go and redesign it such that it actually reflects the real world. Well, ladies and gentlemen who are listening, thank you for tuning in to another episode of What's the Res? Ethan, if any of our listeners have questions for us, how could they contact us?
Listeners, if you want to contact us, you can email us at whatsttheres@gmail.com. That's WHATSTHERES@gmail.com. Or follow us on Instagram at whatsttheres_.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, tune in next time for more What's the Res? Thank you.